Here is the text with proper punctuation. Once more, it's that season. Meteorologists expect La Niña to set in only half a month and perhaps present to us a sharply cold and tumultuous winter. However, what precisely is El Niño's cool sister? How does this regular anomaly create, and what impacts should we prepare for later on? Well, one thing is already clear. Despite the fact that El Niño and La Niña are generally viewed as the big players of global weather, we shouldn't disregard that the polar vortex also has a critical impact on what happens on our doorstep. Without a doubt, the unique connection of the polar vortex and La Niña might, this time, guarantee that we are in for a colder winter that is totally different from the ones that have gone before. Dry spells, extreme flooding, and sudden temperature changes. Sadly, we have now arrived at a point where such extreme weather events are becoming more frequent, with an upsetting level of certainty. According to specialists, they are also becoming increasingly possible. Scientists don't have to look far for the reason behind this unwanted development. Climate change has already increased average annual temperatures globally by 1 degree between 1881 and 2019. In this country, the increase over the same period is as much as 1.6 degrees, and the 10 hottest years since standard weather records began have been measured since 2010. But even the outlook for the future can't be described as especially rosy, considering the specialists' estimates. Since regardless of whether we succeed in promptly halting the warming of the planet, certain climate-related changes can no longer be prevented. In Germany, the related increase in extreme weather events is particularly connected to the risk of storms, extreme heat, heavy precipitation, and flooding. We only need to remember the 100-year flood of 2021, which claimed the lives of a total of 180 people, 135 of them in the Ahr Valley alone, and caused billions of dollars in damage. In the same breath, anyway, the disturbed climate during the winter also causes sudden temperature drops that are as surprising as they are unexpected. Although we have generally looked in vain for a winter wonderland covered in snow and ice lately years, the United States was confronted with an astonishingly cold spell in December 2022 that claimed at least 63 lives. In February 2021, the situation in Texas had been much more dramatic. The lowest temperatures in 30 years had claimed 250 lives. And regardless of ever-rising average temperatures, meteorologists point out that such events are not isolated cases, quite the opposite. According to the National Center for Environmental Information, the frequency of extreme snowstorms has increased in 2/3 of the eastern United States. Of course, the data being referred to specifically relates to the United States, but analysts emphasize that similar developments can be seen in other parts of the world. But why is that so? What are the reasons for this apparent climatic inconsistency? How can a planet that is actually getting increasingly warm experience dramatic cold spells and sudden ice storms at the same time? How do El Niño, La Niña, and the polar vortex impact the weather? Well, the response to this question is complicated, but recently, environmental physicists reported that they had found the real culprits behind the often disconnected weather anomalies. According to them, the collaboration of the polar vortex, El Niño, and La Niña seems to be responsible for the extreme events of the past. Before we go into more detail about the developments that could result for us later on, we should first explain what is really meant by this threesome. Specialists use the term polar vortex to describe the low-pressure vortices that exist at high altitudes over the North and South Poles. These consistently increase during the particular winter, which isn't astonishing, since the absence of sunlight means that the atmosphere can't heat up during this time. Thus, cool air accumulates, and the westerly wind systems related to the polar vortices intensify. Normally, the winter polar vortices are quite stable over the poles, but if the polar vortex weakens, for instance, due to a strong warming of the stratosphere, parts of the current vortex weaken and thus eventually become unstable. As a result, box-like lumps can eventually develop, which can lead to a polar outbreak, or in other words, a movement of extremely cold air masses. When it comes to El Niño and La Niña, anyway, we need to put it nonchalantly, a hot sibling and a cold sister. To put it in a technically correct way, two coarse phenomena create the impacts caused by these anomalies. However, let's first consider the usual situation in the normal course of the sea and air in the tropics. Generally, because the sun's beams hit the Earth more vertically around the equator, the air masses there warm up especially rapidly. They rise and move towards the poles, where they sink over the tropics and then flow back to the equator. Anyway, because the Earth also turns on its own axis, the resulting Coriolis force redirects the air masses westwards as they flow. All these factors mean that the waters of the Pacific off the Peruvian coast are normally around 10 degrees colder than in Indonesia. The trade winds blow from South America in the east to Asia and Oceania in the west, where heavy precipitation and an ocean level up to 60 centimeters higher occur. However, when El Niño comes on the scene, which is the case every few years, the weather is literally flipped around. First, the Pacific, Asia, and Oceania cool down, while temperatures in South America continue to rise. Subsequently, the atmospheric pressure pattern is also reversed. The wind weakens or eventually, indeed, even reverses completely. From this point forward, it will blow from the west toward the east. And when El Niño has weakened after a few months, La Niña typically follows after a short period of balance. This stage generally has the characteristics of the normal state, but it decisively heightens them. At the end of the day, the Pacific Ocean in Asia and Oceania is now especially warm, while the enormous air pressure difference between the west and east further fuels the trade winds. And while El Niño and La Niña, along with normal weather patterns, form the so-called El Niño Southern Oscillation, it's clear that they are accompanied by certain, sometimes extreme, impacts. In El Niño years, southern Africa is threatened by droughts, while the risk of heavy precipitation and flooding increases in the east of the continent. On the other side of the world, in Australia and Indonesia, people face dry periods and fires, while in Peru and Ecuador, the chance of rain, flooding, and avalanches is growing. La Niña, then again, generally brings cooler and wetter weather, which is why it's sometimes even considered to be a positive phenomenon in southern Africa, Southeast Asia, and Australia. But it's also evident that La Niña is associated with colder winters in western Canada, northern US, Japan, and the Korean Peninsula, and repeatedly causes extreme weather events. These include, in particular, an increase in hurricanes along the Atlantic coast of the US. But what about here in Switzerland? Will La Niña and the polar vortex present us with a colder winter of disorder? Well, from a purely meteorological perspective, we in Germany hardly notice the effects of El Niño and La Niña. But we do feel them. On one hand, governments in the Northern Hemisphere change their policies and spending to support affected nations. On the other hand, in the midst of globalization, almost no nation stands alone. However, if El Niño causes a collapse in the fishing industry in Peru or the drying up of soybean fields in Brazil, this will certainly lead to tight supplies in the markets. But besides that, an extreme situation could now also lead to the upcoming winter being anything but normal in our latitudes. In general, the specialists' forecasts indicate that there is a 71% likelihood of a La Niña event happening this winter, which could last until spring. Anyway, as mentioned before, there is also the polar vortex, and since it's now pushing cold air from the Arctic toward Europe, it could, related to La Niña, cause significantly cooler temperatures overall. In fact, meteorologists are even saying that the current weather situation is more unstable than ever. But what exactly does that mean? Is the sharply cold, chaotic winter that is being declared in many headlines nowadays soon going to become a cold reality? As of now, well, we simply don't know. Since the main weather models, ECMWF and GFS, are making completely contradictory predictions in this regard, the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts predicts at least some snow and cold spells, but the global forecast system then suggests that we might actually be in for the hottest winter since weather records began. Anyway, what the two models agree on is the fact that we should prepare for serious weather changes. We could experience extreme temperature fluctuations, and if the polar vortex implodes totally, freezing temperatures and heavy winter weather are also possible in Germany. However, it usually takes the rest of the cold season to really see whether this will occur. So, snow fans should be patient before they get their money's worth. Luckily, by tapping on the subscribe button, you will not need to pay anything. So click on subscribe, and you won't ever need to miss a video from us again. We'll see you soon. This version includes punctuation and maintains the original meaning of the text.